Psychopath versus sociopath, the shocking truth you're missing. Have you ever met someone who looked completely normal, smiled at you, shook your hand, maybe even loved you, yet something inside you whispered, "This person has no soul"? Carl Jung believed that the greatest danger in the world is not the monsters we can see, but the ones who wear a human face. They don't feel guilt, they don't feel empathy, and yet they know exactly how to make you question your own reality. One is calm, calculating, and ice-cold, the psychopath ruled by the predator archetype. The other is emotional, explosive, and unpredictable, the sociopath possessed by the trickster. Most people don't realize they've met one until the damage is done, because these personalities don't break into your home, they break into your mind. In this video, we'll enter the darkest corners of Jung's psychology to expose the true difference between a psychopath and a sociopath, and more importantly, how to recognize when their shadow is trying to merge with yours. Because if you can't spot the danger, you'll become part of it. Part 1. The Jungian roots of the psychopathic and sociopathic mind. From a Jungian point of view, both the psychopath and the sociopath represent distorted expressions of the human psyche when the balance between the conscious ego and the unconscious world collapses. To Jung, every individual carries within them a spectrum of archetypes, forces that shape the personality, behavior, and moral orientation. When these archetypes are integrated, they contribute to psychological wholeness. But when they dominate or are denied, they manifest as pathology. The psychopath and sociopath are not simply products of neurology or social conditioning, they are psychological tragedies of a fractured self, two different ways the psyche has lost its dialogue with the soul. A psychopath in the Jungian sense can be seen as a person whose shadow has completely consumed the persona. The persona, according to Jung, is the social mask, the image one presents to the world to adapt and function within society. The shadow, by contrast, contains the instincts, desires, and impulses that the ego represses or disowns. In a healthy psyche, there is a tension between these two poles, the mask and the repressed, and through awareness, an individual can integrate the shadow to become whole. But in a psychopath, this tension collapses. The shadow takes control, wearing the persona as a disguise. The psychopath no longer represses their dark impulses, they rationalize and glorify them. They feel no conflict because there is no longer a functioning moral center, the ego has become one with the darkness. For sociopaths, the picture is different. They are not born with the same constitutional detachment from empathy as the psychopath. Instead, their lack of conscience often develops from severe emotional trauma, neglect, or social abandonment. In Jungian terms, their persona was never allowed to form properly. It is cracked, unstable, built upon the need to survive rather than the desire to connect. The sociopath still has remnants of guilt, but it is buried under resentment and fear. They know what is wrong, they simply feel disconnected from it. Their shadow is not fully integrated, but constantly breaking through the fragile walls of their ego, leading to erratic or reactive behaviors. While the psychopath is cold and consistent in their manipulation, the sociopath is volatile, emotional, and often self-destructive. Jung would describe these differences through the lens of ego development. For the psychopath, the ego is inflated, an extreme dominance of the I that believes it is godlike and untouchable. They live in an archetypal possession consumed by energies like the destroyer or the trickster, which compel them to manipulate and dominate. The sociopath, on the other hand, suffers from ego fragmentation. Their sense of self is not inflated but fractured. They oscillate between different archetypal identifications: the victim, the avenger, the manipulator, the martyr. Each persona they adopt is an unconscious defense against deep inner emptiness. Jung called this state psychic disintegration, where the personality is governed by autonomous complexes that hijack consciousness. From the Jungian lens, both psychopaths and sociopaths are spiritually amputated. They are cut off from the self, the totality of the psyche that encompasses both the conscious and unconscious realms. The self in Jung's system is the guiding center of wholeness, the divine spark that allows for moral awareness and empathy. The psychopath has severed this connection entirely. They operate within a flat, one-dimensional consciousness where morality, empathy, and transcendence are irrelevant constructs. Their inner world is sterile but efficient, devoid of emotion yet sharp in cognition. The sociopath, in contrast, still feels the echo of that lost self. They know there was once light, but they no longer trust it. Their aggression, deceit, and impulsivity are in part cries for control in a world where the self no longer offers stability. Jung would also interpret these conditions as failures of individuation. Individuation is the lifelong process of integrating the opposites within the psyche, light and shadow, masculine and feminine reason and instinct. To individuate means to accept one's inner darkness consciously rather than act it out unconsciously. The psychopath and sociopath are both trapped in the unconscious enactment of the shadow. They do not integrate it, they become it. The psychopath merges with it, willingly seeing themselves as a superior being above moral law. The sociopath is devoured by it, alternately resisting and succumbing to their darker impulses. Both are unable to achieve wholeness because they cannot stand the mirror of their own humanity. In the Red Book, Jung warned that when one denies the shadow, it turns from a moral problem into a possession. The greater the resistance to the shadow, he wrote, the more it assumes the form of a demon. The psychopath is the embodiment of this demonic archetype, the human who has surrendered entirely to the archetypal energy of destruction. They are not evil in a theological sense, but rather a manifestation of psychic imbalance, an ego so inflated that it believes itself omnipotent. The sociopath's demon is more erratic, one moment seductive the next, violent, reflecting the instability of a soul that oscillates between shame and denial. Jung also spoke of the collective unconscious, the shared layer of human psyche that contains universal patterns of experience. In this sense, both psychopaths and sociopaths are extreme projections of humanity's own disowned darkness. They act out the impulses society represses: domination, manipulation, the hunger for control, and thus become mirrors of civilization's moral decay. The fascination people feel toward them in movies, politics, or corporate leadership reflects an unconscious recognition of their power. They represent the unintegrated shadow of culture itself, efficient, ruthless, devoid of empathy, yet admired for their control and charisma. From this Jungian view, it's not enough to label them disordered. They are manifestations of psychic energy gone rogue. The psychopath channels the archetype of Lucifer, the fallen intellect, cold, brilliant, unfeeling, believing he brings light but spreading corruption. The sociopath channels the wounded child turned predator, the one who was once helpless, now addicted to power because vulnerability feels like death. Both archetypes are rooted in the same tragedy, the loss of connection between ego and self. Without that sacred connection, the psyche becomes a battlefield of autonomous forces. In analyzing their inner world, Jung would likely describe the psychopath as frozen in archetypal inflation. They are stuck at a mythic level of existence, gods in their own narrative, incapable of authentic human feeling. Their calmness, charm, and rationality mask a void. The sociopath, conversely, is trapped in archetypal chaos. Their psyche is flooded with conflicting drives. They swing between tenderness and cruelty, attachment and abandonment. Where the psychopath's shadow is organized and purposeful, the sociopath's shadow is wild and unstable. The absence of empathy in both types can be understood not as a lack of feeling, but as a collapse of symbolic function, the inability to see others as extensions of the self. Empathy in Jungian terms is a function of wholeness. When a person recognizes their own inner darkness, they can recognize suffering in others. The psychopath never reached this point. They see others only as objects of use. The sociopath has glimpsed it, but refuses to feel it fully as it reawakens unbearable pain. In both, the symbolic bridge between I and thou is broken. Jung would also note that these conditions are contagious on a psychic level. The psychopath's detachment can draw others into a state of moral numbness. The sociopath's manipulative chaos can infect others with confusion and guilt. This phenomenon, which Jung called psychic contagion, explains why such personalities often rise to positions of power or influence. They awaken the unintegrated shadows of those around them. Their presence activates fear, fascination, or submission depending on what lies repressed in the observer. Ultimately, the Jungian roots of psychopathy and sociopathy reveal a deeper message. These are not alien monsters among us, but extreme reflections of what happens when the human soul loses contact with its depths. Every person carries a potential for cruelty, deception, and domination. The difference is that most people wrestle with their shadow while the psychopath and sociopath have surrendered to it. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In that sense, understanding these pathologies is not about condemning them, but about recognizing how easily the same forces can rise within any of us when we forget the moral necessity of self-awareness. The first step in protecting oneself and humanity from such darkness is to understand that what looks like emotional coldness or manipulation on the surface is at its core a metaphysical disconnection. It is the soul's severance from meaning, a void masquerading as confidence. In that mirror, Jung invites us to look inward, not to fear the psychopath or the sociopath, but to see how close we each are to becoming one when we refuse to face our own shadow. Part 2. The shadow and the absence of empathy. To understand the absence of empathy in psychopaths and sociopaths through the Jungian lens, we must explore the concept of the shadow, the vast unconscious realm that holds all the impulses, fears, and emotions the conscious ego refuses to face. Jung believed that the shadow is not inherently evil. It is simply the part of the psyche that contains everything the ego denies or rejects. But when the ego disowns too much of itself, when it refuses to confront its darkness, that shadow begins to live a life of its own. It detaches, becomes autonomous, and turns into what Jung described as the thing that thinks it's me. In psychopaths and sociopaths, this shadow isn't just active, it has completely taken over. Empathy, the ability to feel into another being's experience, is not just a moral trait in Jungian psychology. It is a function of integration. When an individual has accepted both their light and their darkness, they become capable of perceiving others as complex, multifaceted beings. The more someone has faced their own pain, the more they can feel the pain of others without being consumed by it. But for those who have not integrated their shadow, empathy becomes impossible because they cannot perceive others beyond projection. The psychopath and the sociopath both live inside a distorted mirror, and in that mirror, other human beings do not appear as full subjects but as reflections to manipulate or destroy. For the psychopath, the absence of empathy is not a conscious choice, it is a structural feature of the psyche. Jung might say that the psychopath's ego is possessed by an archetype, specifically the archetype of the predator. This archetype sees everything through the logic of power, the hunter and the hunted, the master and the victim. The moral or emotional dimension of existence simply doesn't register because the ego is fused with the instinctual shadow. Jung described this as a psychic inflation where the ego identifies with something larger, godlike or demonic. The psychopath's mind operates from this inflated position. They feel beyond morality, beyond consequence, beyond vulnerability. Their stillness, charm, or cold rationality is not calmness. It is the absence of inner conflict. There is no battle between light and dark, because the light has already been extinguished. The sociopath, on the other hand, still lives with some form of conflict. The shadow has not fully devoured their ego. It haunts it, disrupts it, and leaks through in emotional explosions. The sociopath may appear impulsive, reactive, or erratic because their shadow constantly breaks the boundaries of their fragile persona. They feel something, anger, humiliation, rejection, but the emotions are raw and unprocessed. Their empathy is not absent but inverted. They can read emotions in others only to exploit them. They sense pain not as something to connect with, but as a tool to use. Jung would interpret this as a collapse of symbolic awareness. In a healthy psyche, symbols mediate between the inner world and the outer. The sociopath's psyche, by contrast, has lost that bridge. Emotion and instinct are fused. Everything is immediate without reflection. Both psychopaths and sociopaths have one thing in common: a disconnection from the self. The self in Jung's psychology is not the ego, it is the totality of the psyche, the divine center that organizes the personality. It is the source of meaning, purpose, and moral intuition. Empathy emerges from the self because the self recognizes itself in others. When the connection to the self is broken, the world becomes a collection of objects rather than souls. For the psychopath, this disconnection is complete. They live in a barren psychic landscape. For the sociopath, the disconnection is unstable. They are haunted by the echoes of the self they abandoned. In the Archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung wrote that when the shadow is not recognized as part of the self, it appears projected upon others. This means that individuals who cannot face their inner darkness unconsciously assign it to the people around them. Psychopaths and sociopaths live entirely in projection, but not in the way most people do. Ordinary people project their insecurities and fears. Psychopaths project their emptiness. They see others not as mirrors of humanity, but as instruments to fill their void. Every relationship becomes a transaction, an exchange of control, admiration, fear, or energy. Jung would interpret this as a psychic vampirism, the attempt of a disintegrated psyche to feed off the vitality of others in order to maintain its illusion of wholeness. When Jung wrote about the possessed personality, he warned that archetypes could colonize the ego when consciousness fails to regulate the unconscious. The absence of empathy is precisely the sign of such possession. The archetype has taken the driver's seat. In the psychopath, it manifests as cold calculation, the God complex of a being who feels untouchable. In the sociopath, it appears as the desperate need to dominate or manipulate, not for pleasure but for survival. The more disconnected they become from their self, the more power they seek externally through control, through seduction, through chaos. Jung would see this not as evil in a moral sense, but as a spiritual starvation. The absence of empathy is the symptom of a soul that can no longer feel the life of the collective unconscious moving through it. Empathy also requires suffering. Jung said that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Those who have never suffered deeply cannot truly connect to the suffering of others. The psychopath cannot suffer in the existential sense. Their psyche is armored against it. Pain, guilt, and remorse do not penetrate because they would threaten the illusion of omnipotence. The sociopath, by contrast, does feel pain, but only in the form of wounded pride or rejection. Their pain is egoic, not existential. It does not open them to compassion, it makes them resentful. Jung's theory of complexes helps explain this. A complex is an autonomous cluster of emotions and ideas that can hijack consciousness. In the sociopath, these complexes born of early trauma, humiliation, or neglect dominate the personality. Their reactions are not chosen, they are compulsive. They are driven by ancient wounds buried in the shadow, replaying their story through manipulation or violence. The absence of empathy, therefore, is not merely emotional numbness. It is psychic anesthesia. It is what happens when consciousness is flooded by archetypal energy without the moral filter of the self. Jung's patients often described feeling possessed by something non-human. In psychopaths and sociopaths, that possession becomes permanent. Jung might describe the psychopath as a creature of archetype, a human form animated by collective energy that has lost its individual soul. The sociopath remains partially human, still tormented by glimpses of conscience, but they drown it in action, in noise, in the theater of control. The Jungian view also invites us to look beyond the individual and see the cultural shadow at play. We live in a world that rewards narcissism, dominance, and emotional detachment. In that sense, the traits of the psychopath are not just individual pathologies, They are collective ideals. Jung warned that when a society rejects the moral voice of the self, it falls under the rule of its shadow. The glorification of manipulation, the admiration for power without conscience, the fascination with alpha personas, all are signs of a collective psychopathy. The absence of empathy in individuals mirrors the moral emptiness of the culture that shaped them. At the heart of the matter is Jung's concept of inversion. The psychopath's intelligence and charm are not genuine virtues. They are inversions of light. Their charisma is a shadow form of inspiration, magnetism without compassion. Their rationality is a shadow form of wisdom logic without conscience. The sociopath's passion is also inverted intensity, without love attachment, without loyalty. These inversions occur when psychic energy is cut off from its source in the self and circulates only within the ego. Jung described this as psychic short-circuiting. The libido, the vital life energy, no longer flows through the total personality. It becomes trapped in patterns of dominance and control. In such a system, empathy is not just absent, it becomes irrelevant. Jung's writings on the manner personality, the ego inflated with archetypal power, shed further light on psychopathy. The psychopath's confidence and charm arise from this inflation. They radiate certainty because they are unconsciously identified with the divine archetype of the king or god. But unlike the individuated person who channels divine energy with humility, the psychopath confuses possession with mastery. They believe they are the source of that power. Jung warned that such identification leads to psychic catastrophe because no human ego can sustain divine energy without corruption. The absence of empathy, therefore, is the natural byproduct of this inflation. The ego must deny all human vulnerability to maintain the illusion of omnipotence. For the sociopath, Jung might focus on the archetype of the wounded child and the trickster. Their lack of empathy is rooted not in coldness, but in pain. They were betrayed early in life, taught that connection equals danger. Their empathy atrophied not because they lacked it, but because it hurt too much to feel. Over time, emotional repression turned into emotional manipulation. Their reading of others becomes defensive. They watch to anticipate threat to control before being controlled. Jung would see this as the shadow of the trickster, the archetype that uses cunning to survive. But behind the sociopath's chaos lies a deeper truth, a longing for the lost self, for the safety they never found. Their cruelty is the language of their unhealed wound. Jung's model of the four functions of consciousness, thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensation, also offers insight. Empathy is primarily a function of feeling, the capacity to evaluate human experience in terms of value and meaning. In the psychopath, the feeling function is completely repressed. It is replaced by hyper-developed thinking and intuition. They can analyze emotions intellectually but cannot experience them. In the sociopath, the feeling function is distorted. It is overactive but disconnected from moral judgment. They feel intensely but superficially, and their intuition is used for manipulation rather than understanding. Jung would describe both as one-sided personalities, trapped in the tyranny of the inferior function, a psychological imbalance that always leads to pathology. When Jung said that evil is the lack of empathy, he did not mean it in a religious sense. He meant that evil arises when consciousness refuses to relate, when it separates itself from the whole. The psychopath's evil is absolute separation, the ego enthroned as God. The sociopath's evil is emotional chaos, the ego drowning in its own projections. Both are failures of relationship, both internally with the self and externally with others. Empathy is the bridge that connects these worlds. Its absence signifies not only moral decay, but spiritual death. The Jungian therapist's task in theory would be to restore that bridge. But with psychopaths and sociopaths, Jung recognized the near impossibility of this. For integration to occur, there must be some spark of self-awareness, some fragment of the observing ego capable of reflection. The psychopath lacks this completely. The sociopath possesses it intermittently. Jung compared the process of confronting the shadow to descending into the underworld. It requires humility, suffering, and a willingness to die symbolically. The psychopath refuses this descent. They are already at home in the underworld. The sociopath enters it unconsciously, but without guidance they mistake its darkness for power. Empathy cannot be taught through intellect. It must arise through inner transformation. In Jungian language, this transformation happens when the ego confronts the shadow and realizes that evil and good are both part of the same totality. The integrated person does not reject the shadow, they dialogue with it. The psychopath and sociopath have lost that dialogue. For them, the shadow speaks alone. Their voices, their actions, their charm, all are echoes of the unconscious speaking through a hollow shell of humanity. Jung once said that the modern world suffers from the loss of soul. The psychopath and sociopath are the ultimate expression of that loss. They remind us of what happens when the individual and the culture refuses to feel. Their absence of empathy is not just psychological, it is metaphysical. It reflects a rupture in the human connection to the sacred. To live without empathy is to live without participation in the mystery of life. It is to exist in a sterile reality where others are not fellow travelers of the soul, but mere reflections in a hall of mirrors. Jung's great warning was that we all carry this potential. Every time we repress our pain, deny our shame, or dehumanize others, we move closer to that same absence of empathy. The psychopath and sociopath are not alien species, they are distorted versions of ourselves, magnifications of what happens when the shadow is not faced. The difference is one of degree, not of kind. To look into their psyche, as Jung would insist, is to confront our own. Their condition shows us that empathy is not a luxury or a moral ornament. It is the lifeline of the psyche. Without it, consciousness collapses into cold intellect or emotional chaos. Without it, the world loses its soul. And perhaps this is the most haunting insight Jung would offer, that the psychopath and the sociopath are not just individuals lost in darkness, they are symbols of what humanity becomes when it forgets to feel. Part 3. The archetypes behind their behavior. From the Jungian perspective, every act of cruelty, manipulation, or control is not just a personal choice, it is the expression of an archetype moving through the psyche. Jung taught that archetypes are primordial patterns of behavior and imagination that dwell in the collective unconscious, shaping how we experience love, fear, power, and morality. In psychopaths and sociopaths, these archetypes are not balanced or integrated. They dominate. They possess. They turn the individual into a vessel through which raw, unmediated instinct speaks. Understanding these archetypes, the predator, the trickster, and the tyrant king, reveals not only what drives these personalities, but also what happens when the human soul loses control of the energies that were meant to be mastered, not obeyed. The predator archetype lies at the heart of psychopathy. It is the most ancient form of intelligence, the cold, calculating instinct to hunt, dominate, and consume. The predator does not hate, it simply acts according to its nature. In the psychopath, this archetype fuses with consciousness. The result is a person who no longer perceives others as independent beings, but as prey objects of utility, challenges to conquer, or mirrors to manipulate. Jung would describe this as a possession by the shadow's autonomous energy. The psychopath's detachment, their unnerving calm, their charm, it all stems from this archetypal possession. There is no empathy because empathy would disrupt the predator's efficiency. What makes the predator archetype so seductive is that it appears rational, strategic, and even admirable in a society that worships control and success. The psychopath, as Jung might note, is often rewarded because the world itself has fallen under the same archetype. In the corporate world, in politics, even in relationships, the cold, dominant energy of the predator is mistaken for leadership, intelligence, and strength. But underneath that facade lies an abyss, the absence of soul. The predator acts without conscience because it has no connection to the self. It operates purely from the instinctual strata of the psyche. The individual, therefore, is not fully human in the spiritual sense. They are a personification of nature's ruthlessness divorced from meaning. By contrast, the trickster archetype often dominates the sociopath. The trickster is the shapeshifter, the liar, the one who bends truth and plays roles to survive. In mythology, the trickster teaches through chaos, forcing people to see their illusions. But when this archetype possesses a person who lacks moral structure, it becomes malignant. The sociopath's ability to mimic emotion, to charm, to mirror others' desires, all of this stems from the trickster energy. They are social chameleons, not because they seek harmony, but because their identity is fluid and fragmented. Jung would describe this as psychic mimicry, a survival mechanism born from early trauma, when authenticity became dangerous. The sociopath's trickster is different from the psychopath's predator in one crucial way: it still longs for validation. The sociopath wants to win not just control, but recognition. Deep down, they crave the very empathy they cannot sustain. They want to be loved, but their internal disintegration makes love unbearable. Thus, they oscillate between seduction and sabotage, luring others close only to betray them. Jung would interpret this as an endless repetition of the original wound, the child who was betrayed now reenacting betrayal to maintain power. The trickster, when unintegrated, becomes a demon of self-sabotage, destroying the very connections it pretends to create. Then there is the tyrant king archetype, which unites both predator and trickster within the inflated ego. The tyrant is the archetype of domination, control, and the illusion of omnipotence. In mythology, it appears as the ruler who believes he is divine, who demands absolute loyalty and punishes dissent. Jung saw this archetype emerge when the ego identifies with the God image instead of serving it. The tyrant does not recognize the self as an autonomous center. It crowns itself as God. This is why psychopaths and sociopaths can appear so certain, so commanding, even magnetic. They radiate the archetypal energy of the king, but without compassion, without humility, without connection to the sacred. The result is tyranny, both inner and outer. When the tyrant archetype takes over, empathy becomes weakness. Vulnerability becomes sin. To maintain control, the ego must suppress anything that reminds it of limitation or dependency. The psychopath therefore denies fear and conscience. The sociopath denies shame and belonging. Both are ruled by an unconscious need to dominate the internal world of emotion before it dominates them. Jung would call this archetypal inflation, the moment when the ego mistakes the voice of the archetype for its own. The person no longer acts, they are acted through. The archetype uses them as its instrument. Jung's notion of autonomous complexes helps explain why these archetypes are so powerful. A complex is a cluster of unconscious emotions, images, and memories that function independently of the ego. In ordinary people, complexes appear as moods or habits. In psychopaths and sociopaths, they take full control. The predator complex makes cruelty feel natural. The trickster complex makes lying feel effortless. The tyrant complex makes domination feel righteous. Jung emphasized that when consciousness is weak, these complexes behave like personalities with their own wills. The psychopath and sociopath, therefore, are not merely manipulative, they are inhabited. Their sense of self is fragmented into archetypal impulses, each seeking expression through human behavior. In psychology and religion, Jung warned that when the gods are not recognized, they become diseases. In other words, when archetypal forces are denied symbolic expression through art, ritual, or moral awareness, they erupt as psychopathology. The psychopath's obsession with power and control is a desecrated form of the hero's quest for mastery. The sociopath's deceit is a corrupted version of the trickster's sacred playfulness. Both represent what happens when divine energy is perverted by the ego's hunger. They are, in a sense, spiritual caricatures, expressions of divine archetypes that have lost their connection to transcendence. The absence of empathy is therefore not a defect, but a symptom of archetypal imbalance. The predator destroys, the trickster deceives, and the tyrant dominates because empathy would interfere with their purpose. Empathy belongs to another archetype, the healer, or the mother, or the self energies, rooted in compassion, nurturance, and unity. When these are repressed, the psyche tilts toward destruction. Jung would call this enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites. The more someone denies their capacity for love, the more they become possessed by hate. The more they suppress weakness, the more their cruelty grows. Psychopaths and sociopaths are extreme examples of this law. Their inner war has ended not in peace but in conquest. One archetype has destroyed all others. Yet even within this darkness, Jung would see meaning. The existence of such individuals exposes the potential for evil within the collective psyche. They act out the hidden archetypes of society itself. The corporate predator, the manipulative politician, the charming abuser, all are reflections of the archetypal energies that civilization refuses to acknowledge. Jung insisted that the only way to prevent being ruled by these forces is to confront them consciously. To look at the psychopath and the sociopath is to see the shadow of humanity, the parts that crave control, domination, and deceit. The danger is not that such people exist, but that we are fascinated by them. Our admiration reveals how easily the same archetypes live within us, waiting for denial to give them life. In the structure of the psyche, the archetypes are meant to balance one another. The king must be guided by the sage, the warrior by the lover, the trickster by the healer. But when trauma, ego inflation, or moral corruption suppresses this balance, one archetype rules unchecked. The psychopath lives in the eternal reign of the tyrant king. The sociopath dances forever with the trickster. Both have exiled the healer and the lover, and with them the capacity for empathy. Jung would call this psychic totalitarianism, the rule of one archetype over the whole personality. The Jungian analyst Edward Edinger later expanded on this, suggesting that such individuals experience a collapse of the symbolic attitude. They can no longer relate to images or meanings beyond themselves. Symbols which connect the personal to the divine become meaningless. This explains why psychopaths and sociopaths appear spiritually dead. They cannot perceive transcendence. Everything is literal, material, instrumental. The archetypes that animate them no longer point toward transformation. They have become static identities. In Jungian terms, their inner world has become desymbolized. And when life loses its symbols, only power remains. At the deepest level, Jung would see in the psychopath and sociopath a warning for all humanity. The archetypes that rule them, predator, trickster, tyrant, are not foreign. They are part of every human psyche. We all have moments when we manipulate, when we dominate, when we pretend. The difference is that the integrated person recognizes these impulses as parts of the shadow and brings them into awareness. The unintegrated person denies them, allowing them to grow in the dark until they take control. Thus, the psychopath and sociopath are not anomalies. They are symbols of psychic imbalance pushed to its extreme. In this sense, empathy is not only a moral quality, it is a sign of balance. To empathize is to feel both the lover and the warrior, the king and the healer, the shadow and the light coexisting within. The psychopath cannot empathize because only one voice speaks inside them, the predators. The sociopath cannot sustain empathy because the trickster keeps changing masks. Jung's insight reminds us that true empathy requires multiplicity, the ability to hold contradictions without collapsing. When the psyche becomes one-dimensional, empathy dies. The archetypes behind their behavior reveal a cosmic tragedy. These are not simply broken people. They are symbols of archetypal possession of divine energies turned destructive. The predator, the trickster, and the tyrant are not evil by nature. They are necessary forces when integrated. The predator gives us instinct. The trickster gives us adaptability. The king gives us order. But without the balancing influence of love, humility, and reflection, they devour the soul that hosts them. Jung would likely say that every psychopath and sociopath is a myth, walking in human form, an ancient energy wearing a modern face. And through them, the collective unconscious reminds us of one truth, that the line between creation and destruction runs not through the world, but through the human psyche itself. Part 4. Why you need to know this: protecting your psyche. Carl Jung taught that awareness is the only true defense against darkness. In his words, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Understanding the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath isn't just an intellectual exercise, it is an act of psychic self-protection. When we fail to recognize these patterns, we unconsciously invite them into our lives, allowing the shadow of another person to merge with our own. Jung's depth psychology reveals that evil doesn't simply come from outside. It enters through the cracks in our awareness. The less you understand of your own unconscious, the easier it is for someone else's unconscious to control you. The psychopath and sociopath are both carriers of psychic contagion. Jung used this term to describe how unconscious energies can spread between people bypassing logic or morality. When you are near someone who lacks empathy, your emotional field begins to distort. You start doubting your own perceptions, rationalizing their cruelty, excusing their manipulation. It is as if your inner compass becomes magnetized by their energy. This is how the shadow spreads through fascination, through denial, through projection. Jung would say that the psychopath awakens the unintegrated shadow within you. Their coldness triggers your need to prove your warmth. Their control triggers your submission. Their indifference triggers your craving for validation. Before you realize it, you're no longer dealing with another person, you're battling your own unconscious needs reflected through them. Understanding this psychological mechanism is vital because it dismantles the illusion of victimhood. Jung did not believe in the naive division of good and evil people. He saw that each of us contains both the potential for cruelty and compassion, domination and empathy. When you meet someone who embodies one side completely, your task is not only to protect yourself externally, but to confront the part of you that responds to them internally. The psychopath's void attracts the empath's need to fill it. The sociopath's chaos attracts the rescuer's need to fix it. These are archetypal patterns, the victim, the savior, the redeemer that keep light bound to darkness. Jung called this the participation mystique, a psychic fusion between two unconscious minds. The more unaware you are of your own shadow, the more you become entangled in someone else's. Empaths in particular are vulnerable to this dynamic. Their natural attunement to emotion makes them ideal targets for people who lack empathy. The empath feels the pain that the psychopath cannot feel, and the sociopath learns to mimic. This creates an energetic imbalance where the empath begins to lose their own boundaries. Jung would interpret this as an incomplete individuation process. The empath has not yet learned to differentiate compassion from self-sacrifice. The moment empathy becomes identification, it stops being healing and becomes destructive. You begin to carry what does not belong to you. You become a host for the other person's shadow. The most dangerous power of the psychopath and sociopath lies in their ability to distort your perception of reality. Jung called this psychic inflation through projection. The psychopath projects their inner void onto you, making you feel inadequate, guilty, or insane. You start to doubt your instincts because your intuition, your connection to the self, becomes hijacked. The sociopath, through emotional manipulation, keeps you oscillating between hope and fear. They feed on your reactions because your emotional energy sustains their fragile sense of self. Jung might describe this as vampiric attachment, a transfer of psychic energy from the empathic soul to the fragmented one. Once you see it through the Jungian lens, the dynamic is no longer mysterious, it's mechanical. It is the shadow-consuming light because the light refuses to shine inward. Knowledge therefore becomes the first act of liberation. Recognizing these patterns allows you to reclaim projection and restore your psychic center. Jung's process of shadow integration teaches that you cannot destroy darkness. You can only transform it by bringing it into consciousness. When you acknowledge the part of you that seeks to heal the unhealable, that wants to redeem, the irredeemable, that feels compelled to fix what is broken, you take back your power. You realize that you are not obligated to rescue others from their unconscious. You can have compassion without bondage. You can understand evil without merging with it. This is not detachment, it is individuation. Jung warned that the possession of knowledge carries the obligation to act. Once you understand the inner mechanics of psychopathy and sociopathy, you can no longer pretend ignorance. You begin to see the subtle forms of manipulation everywhere in workplaces, families, institutions, even within yourself. The point is not paranoia, it is clarity. When you recognize the archetype, you disarm it. The predator loses its power when you stop playing prey. The trickster loses its grip when you stop reacting to illusion. The tyrant loses its authority when you stop worshipping control. Jung's insight was that evil survives only in the unconscious. Once illuminated, it cannot sustain itself. To name something is to bring it into the realm of the self where transformation begins. Protecting your psyche from such forces requires 3 Jungian disciplines: awareness, boundaries, and integration. Awareness means seeing reality without distortion, observing behavior instead of believing promises. It is the capacity to sense energy beyond words. Boundaries mean refusing to let your empathy become absorption. You can feel someone's pain without carrying it. You can witness manipulation without internalizing blame. And integration means confronting your own darkness so that no external darkness can seduce you. Jung insisted that the only way to avoid being possessed by the shadow is to accept that it exists within you. The person who denies their aggression will attract aggressors. The person who denies their need for control will submit to controllers. The more you accept your shadow, the less power others' shadows have over you. Empathy in its highest form does not mean endless forgiveness. It means discernment. Jung's mature empathy is grounded in wisdom. It sees through the mask. It knows that compassion without consciousness leads to destruction. Psychopaths and sociopaths exploit emotional blindness. They cannot manipulate someone who sees them clearly. Their power depends on your confusion. Once you name what they are, a person possessed by archetypal darkness, you break the spell. Jung would describe this as reclaiming psychic sovereignty, the moment when the self reclaims authority from the possessed ego. You are no longer an extension of someone else's unconscious drama. You are whole within yourself. It is also essential to recognize the difference between understanding and excusing. Jung never advocated moral relativism. He understood evil as part of the human condition but refused to justify it. Compassion must be balanced by accountability. The psychopath is not simply broken, they are dangerous. The sociopath is not merely hurt, they are destructive when unchecked. To recognize their humanity does not mean to surrender to it. Jung's approach was not sentimental, it was clinical and spiritual. He believed that confronting darkness with open eyes is the only true form of compassion because it prevents evil from spreading further. On a collective level, this understanding protects society itself. When individuals fail to recognize psychopathic and sociopathic traits, these personalities rise to positions of power. Jung observed that entire nations could fall under the possession of an archetype, as seen in totalitarian regimes where charisma replaced conscience. The same mechanism that operates in personal relationships operates at the cultural scale. The people project their shadow onto a savior who mirrors their hidden desires for dominance or vengeance. By studying psychopathy through the Jungian lens, we learn to see these projections before they metastasize into history's catastrophes. Awareness then becomes not only psychological hygiene but moral duty. Jung's philosophy offers a paradoxical redemption. Even the existence of such darkness has meaning. It forces consciousness to evolve. Just as the alchemists believed that gold could only be extracted from base matter, Jung saw that wisdom arises from confronting corruption. When you recognize psychopathy in another, you are invited to examine where within yourself you have surrendered empathy for control, truth for comfort, or authenticity for power. The psychopath externalizes what we repress. The sociopath dramatizes what we deny. Their existence is humanity's mirror, a dark reflection that demands inner transformation. To protect your psyche is to protect your soul. It means refusing to play the unconscious roles that keep darkness alive. It means saying no when manipulation demands yes. It means walking away when charm disguises emptiness. Jung would say that such choices are not just psychological, they are spiritual acts. Each time you choose consciousness over compulsion, you affirm the sovereignty of the self. Each time you refuse to be drawn into the orbit of someone's possession, you restore order to your own inner world. This is how individuation protects, not through isolation but through awareness rooted in truth. In the end, Jung's depth psychology teaches that the real danger is not encountering a psychopath or sociopath, it is failing to recognize what they awaken within you. They are external manifestations of the same archetypal forces that move through all of us. To understand them is to understand yourself. To identify their patterns is to confront your own potential for unconscious cruelty. And to protect your psyche is to walk the narrow path Jung called the way of individuation, where light and darkness are not enemies, but partners in the creation of wholeness. Only the conscious soul, grounded in empathy yet fortified by boundaries, can face such darkness without being consumed by it. The line between light and darkness doesn't run between people, it runs through every human heart. That's what Jung tried to teach us. The psychopath and sociopath show us what happens when the shadow wins, when empathy dies, when the self disconnects, when the soul becomes hollow. But remember, this awareness is protection. Every time you choose to see clearly instead of denying what you feel, you take your power back from the darkness. Every time you refuse to play someone's manipulation game, you are no longer part of their possession. You can't heal them. You can't save them. But you can save yourself by refusing to abandon your own empathy in the process. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more videos that awaken your awareness, protect your spirit, and deepen your understanding of the human soul, because the greatest form of light is consciousness, and consciousness begins right here.